Okay, today my guest is Professor Rosalie Tung. I'll keep my introduction short to maximize our time with her. In the next 30 minutes or so, we'll talk about Rosalie as a person, Professor Tung is a thought leader and an esteemed scholar, and finally is a mentor to many PhD students and junior faculty. For the sake of time, I'll skip many of her accomplishments and give you a very quick snapshot. Professor Tung is an AIB Fellow, as well as a Fellow of the Academy of Management, the British Academy of Management, the International Academy of Intercultural Research, and the Royal Society of Canada. She has served as the Dean of the Fellows, the President of the AIB, and the President of the Academy of Management. In 2021, Rosalie received the John Dunning AIB President's Award in recognition of outstanding service to AIB and the field of international business, in addition to the gold medal for more substantial contributions to JIBS, the 2019 Academy of Management's Distinguished Service Award, 2020 AOM IM Division Outstanding Service to Global Community Award, and the most recent International Management Division Eminent Scholar Award. Rosalie is a past editor of Cross-Cultural and Strategic Management. She also served as an area editor at JIBS and is a senior editor at the Journal of World Business. Thank you, Rosalie, for joining us.
Well, thank you, Ilgaz.
First question, what did you want to become when you were a child?
That's a very good question. I think I have to put that in a little bit of a context in order to properly answer the question. I grew up before the women's liberation movement. And so back then, the role expectations of women and the careers that they pursue were very different from what it is today. So back then, the role expectations were that women were supposed to be mothers, and if they were to work outside of the home, primarily it would be as grade school teachers or nurses. So there were very few role models for me. Mind you, I have the greatest respect for mothers, for grade school teachers, and also for nurses, because they play a very important role in terms of nurturing, in terms of education, in terms of informing the next generation of young people. So, so as to role expectations, I knew that I wanted to do something that was different from the traditional women's role. Okay, exactly what I didn't know at that time. I knew that I wanted to be an inventor, but exactly what I was going to invent, I didn't know. One thing I did know was that education was really the key. And so I needed to be highly educated. And to a certain extent, education came naturally in the sense that the Chinese have always emphasized education. Scholars, for instance, in ancient Chinese society were always held in high esteem. And I think even today, you know, that they're held in high esteem. And my parents, who have gone through the ravages of World War II, have always told me that with war, one can lose one's wealth, personal properties, but what you have up here, what you learned, what you studied can never be taken away from you. So from a very early age, I'd always known that education was important. So, and so in looking back, I think to a certain extent, I've fulfilled the role of being an inventor to the extent that when we engage in research, when we engage in good teaching, we are inventors, we're creating knowledge to a certain extent. And it also fulfills that role of nurturing that I talked about, which is we're really, you know, passing on what we learn to the next generation of young people. And it reminds me that teaching and research to a large extent really are a sacred profession in the sense that of what Aristotle said, you know, that, you know, parents give us life, but teachers are really the people that give us the wherewithal to living a good, you know, and prosperous life.
And where did you grow up?
I grew up in Hong Kong.
And then how did you move to?
Okay, so I grew up in Hong Kong, and then I emigrated with my parents to Canada. Okay, and then after I got my 3 degrees from Canada, My PhD was from the University of British Columbia. I went down to the States, taught there for about 14 and a half years. And then, when a chair professorship opened up at Simon Fraser University, because I've lived in Vancouver before. So I really liked the place. And at that time I said, it would be nice to, go back. And then, so I've been here for quite a while.
Okay. And can you remember the first time you realized that there's international versus domestic? Obviously in Hong Kong, this is easier than mainland China.
Yeah. So I actually realized that when I was very young, okay, and as you said, most probably it stems from the fact that I grew up, even though I was not born in Hong Kong, but I was raised in Hong Kong. So from a very early age, I would say even before I entered grade 1, I realized the distinction between domestic and foreign, okay? And the reason why I realized that was first because Hong Kong then was a British Crown colony, so the top echelons of society, be it government, business, were all occupied by the British. So therefore, there was always that foreign domestic kind of distinction. I also went to a Catholic school, a Catholic all-girls school that was run by Italian nuns. So all the best schools in Hong Kong, and I think to a certain extent in many of the emerging economies, are run by Catholic religious orders. And so from a very early age, my classmates were either the children, of course, I have a lot of Chinese classmates, but I also had classmates who were the children of British and Portuguese expatriates. And you will say, why Portuguese? Well, because Hong Kong is close enough to Macau, which then was a Portuguese colony. There were also children who were whose parents were merchants from India and Persia. So I grew up in a very cultural kind of environment. And so at a front row seat, in a sense, to multicultural teams, which at least I later learned about, and also was able to watch the dynamics. I observed very early on about the functional and dysfunctional consequences that could be associated, with having multicultural teams. For instance, I saw that conflicts sometimes could arise among children or my schoolmates from different cultural backgrounds, but strong bonds and friendships could also be formed between people from, different cultural backgrounds. I also saw that the priests and the nuns who were from overseas, a lot of them came from Italy, could also form very strong bonds with the people in the local community itself. So I saw the positive aspects of it, but I also saw the dysfunctional aspects, which was that there was a great deal of inequity in society. For instance, all the top echelons being occupied by the British, regardless of competencies. And I also saw that decisions were often made in the British Parliament, which was thousands and thousands of miles away, without regard to the desires of people who were living in Hong Kong. So later on, of course, when I look at it, I say, oh, well, isn't that almost like the dynamics between head office and subsidiaries itself? So even though I didn't realize those terms at that time, but I became very aware and attuned to these kinds of differences and some of the dynamics that were associated with it.
Rosalie, how did you choose academia, and within academia, international? I can now make a connection between international management pursuits and your life, your upbringing. Mm-hmm. But how did you decide to pursue academia specifically, especially in Canada?
Well, it ties in with my answer to the to one of your first questions, which is that I knew that I needed a good education in order to be an inventor, quote unquote, after so pursuing an MBA at that time was something which was very novel for a woman. So I did that, and as I was finishing up my MBA program, I found that I really liked what I was doing. So I decided to go on for a PhD, okay? And so given my background, I told my supervisor at the time that I wanted to do my doctoral dissertation on something that was related to international business. And my supervisor, Professor Vance Mitchell, said, that this is something that I shouldn't do. So one has, again, to put this in context, because in the late 70s, cross-cultural research was not in vogue. In fact, it could be downright detrimental to one's career because, there were very few publications that one can, think of. I could, still remember the article by Hans Schollhammer and On Looking at an Elephant. So my supervisor is one of the nicest persons that a PhD student could have. So he told me, he said, Rosalie, why don't you choose a topic that you can demonstrate your competencies in? And after that, you'll have a lifetime to pursue what you're interested in. So I took his advice literally. And because of my interest, I really didn't look back. But in terms of my publications, for instance, my first major publication was not on international business. It was a 1979 article in the Academic Management Journal that grew out from my dissertation, which related to organizational environments and organizational structure. So, and it was only later, that I had an article in international business. So that was the Columbia Journal World Business article on selection and training of expatriates.
Perfect. Something that is not on your CV, but people might find interesting about it.
Okay. There are lots of things, okay, but I think there is time for me to talk about only two. One is the fact that I was raised and spent the formative years of my life in Hong Kong. And my parents, well, both of them are Chinese. My father was very Western in his education and outlook. My mother, in contrast, espoused strong Chinese traditions and also was a very strong Catholic. Okay, so I grew up, like seeing that differences can bring about a lot of benefits. Okay, and that it's possible to reap the benefits from such diversity itself. So even though I'm Chinese, I grew up bicultural and bilingual from a very early age onwards. So that's one of the things. The second thing that people most probably don't know is that I'm a strong introvert. And I didn't know until after the two WAVE AIB Women's Fellows sessions that was championed by Lorraine at the 2020 and the 2021 meetings, that when we had this gathering of women's fellows, when I found out that actually quite a number of my esteemed colleagues at AIB were also introverts. So I find that to be, quite surprising in a sense.
It's almost like a tool of the trade. But about alternative career path, if you didn't become a successful scholar, what would you do? What would be the second best alternative career path for you?
I've always had an interest, as I indicated at the beginning, about the nurturing aspects of doing something that would be nurturing. So if I did not embark on an academic career, I would most probably have devoted my time to helping women and girls in countries that really do not have the kinds of privileges that we have. So I think it's important for me, or what I would most probably do would be to, go to these places and educate young women and girls so that they do have the kinds of opportunities that we have in developed societies itself. But I would say that I feel very privileged in terms of what I'm doing, so I'm happy with what I'm doing. But if I had to choose a second career, I think that's most probably what I want to do.
Perfect. About regrets, anything that you've done in the past that you think you shouldn't have done, or something that you missed as an opportunity? Regrets?
I really couldn't think of any. Okay, this is not to suggest that I've accomplished whatever all the things that I want to do, but to me, the greatest regret in life would be if I set my sights on something and I didn't want to do it, or at least didn't want to try it, because I was afraid of failure. I would say that if I set my sights on something, I would want to put my best effort into it. And if I fail to accomplish what I set out to accomplish, then at least I could say, well, I tried. It may not have worked, but at least I, did put in my best effort.
Perfect. Now, what are you most passionate about?
What am I most passionate about? I'm most passionate about doing things well. Okay, and both of my parents are perfectionists. My mother, in particular, she always says that if you, put your effort, if you spend a lot of time on something, it has to come out well, because the product has to stand the test of time. So that was something that I grew up with. I'm heavily influenced by my parents, but particularly by what my mother, all the wisdom that she has imparted on me. So she said, make sure that you do everything well, okay, regardless of what the outcome is, but the product has to stand the test of time. So that's something that has always stuck with me. So if I, set my sights on something, I would say, okay, I know that it might require the learning of new skills, or spending a lot of hours in accomplishing that, but I'm willing to do it because it has to stand the test of time. So that's what I'm passionate about.
But it's very difficult, isn't it, to stand the test of time? Yeah, I mean, things we do every day, they don't really stand anything. Very few things can stand the test of time.
Yeah, well, I guess standing the test of time, maybe has a special connotation to us in research. But what my mother meant was that she said, let's say, even if you are going to sew something, okay, you have to sew it well, okay, because that sewing has to be, it could be viewed by other people, okay, or at least it has to last a certain period of time. Okay, until let's say the entire piece of cloth is all tattered, and it could no longer be used. So that's what she meant by standing the test of time, and that's what I learned from her, in the sense that, so even though it takes a lot more time to sew it neatly, sew it nicely, make sure that every little nook and cranny is covered, but that's what it means to stand the test of time. So I guess it's a little bit different, in an academic context, when we say, a certain theory stands the test of time. It's not meant in that kind of context.
Perfect. But it's going to trickle down to research as well. I would like to see how you approach empirical papers, one variable at a time, one data point at a time. Okay, about research. How do you explain your research to people who don't read your work regularly, say in a pub, in a coffee shop? And how do you explain the importance of your research?
Okay. So if I were to talk to an audience that is not familiar with the academic jargon, if I were, talk to, people in different social groups, I would tell them that I am a teacher of new knowledge. Okay, obviously I would drop the terms of evidence-based research because that has no meaning to people. But I would say that the new knowledge that I'm sharing with them, or that I've learned, is on how people from different backgrounds and experiences can work together more harmoniously. And I know that even if we're dealing with very small societies where there's a lot more homogeneity, there could still be differences based on, let's say, gender, based on age, and that could sometimes be the cause of conflict. So I would say, that my research helps people understand, why these kinds of conflicts might occur and how to minimize those and lead to more positive kinds of outcomes. And to a certain extent, the research that I've done, particularly on expatriate assignments, international diversity, it really looks at what separates or what are the potential sources of conflict among groups. So what are some of the ways in which we can mitigate or minimize some of these differences and focus more on the positives as opposed to the negatives that may be associated with such kind of interactions. So that's how I would explain to them. And I think people in most societies would be able to appreciate or understand that.
Yes, thank you. About omitted variables, neglected areas of research, things we have done, covered, but maybe we should do more of for future research. What are those going to be for you?
I think variables perhaps may not be the correct term, and it's not that I mean this in a disrespectful manner, because I see quite a bit of research wherein people add 2 or 3 more new variables, but it's only of marginal increments to the general pool of knowledge that we have. So I would focus more on the different approaches, like encouraging certain types of approaches to research. For instance, if we were to look at our top journal, JIBS, I see that the lenses or the perspectives that we have used to date primarily come from management, strategic management, economics, but there are certain other disciplines that are less represented. So I certainly hope that these different lenses could be introduced more into our publications, and that stems from the fact that IB really is multidisciplinary in nature. I'd also like to see the use of more non-Western lenses in terms of our research. Perhaps rightly so. To date, our research has focused very much on a Western, and by Western I mean North American and Euro-centric kinds of approaches and lenses. I think a lot of progress has been made using those kinds of lenses, but we can certainly make improvements by using some of the non-Western lenses. To give you an example, for instance, if we're to look at the yin-yang perspective, I think, and many people tend to associate yin-yang perspective with paradoxes, okay? But it's really quite different from paradox in that sense. And I think given the contradictions that we see in society today, the divisions, I think the yin-yang perspective or some of the non-Western perspectives could be very useful. I think we can also entertain a greater diversity of research methodologies, okay, different paradigmatic approaches to understanding international business phenomena. And again, that stems from the fact that IB is so multidisciplinary in nature. I was actually quite struck by how important it would be for us to develop these different kinds of approaches, because in the 2020 Munich Security Conference, it was entitled as Westlessness. I think most probably you've heard of this conference. So in essence, the Western countries or powers were looking at, like, what is the role for the Western alliance? What is the role of multilateralism, of Western values in a world wherein the geopolitical dimensions are changing so rapidly? So in a sense, the world that we know in the future will be very different from what we have known in the past 20, 30, or even 50 years. Okay, so how can our research actually reflect and capture those new dynamics? And that's what I hope to encourage a lot more research. rather than, so I'm not discounting research that adds, one or two new variables, but I think perhaps we have to, look at research from new perspectives, so as to generate knowledge, new knowledge that really could help us address many of the issues that are happening around the world today.
I want to talk about the evolution of the field, but obviously 1970s and early on, things were a lot more multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary, and then things converged into something more silos and rather with boundaries. You've seen a pattern, you've seen evolution, and can you talk to us about what they will gain, what they will lost along this evolutionary path?
Okay. I'll preface it by saying that I was fortunate to have met and interacted and learned from many of the founding fathers of international business. So, for instance, I've met Dick Robinson, Dick Farmer, Hans Florelli, Stefan Roebuck, Ken Simmons. Okay, in fact, Dick Robinson spent, his time at the Foreign Investment Commission in China coincided with mine. And so, back then in Beijing, when outsiders, lived in the same compound, had, lunch, dinner all together, so I was fortunate to spend a lot of time with him and his wife. So I learned a lot from them. And so the founding fathers came from different disciplines. So IB is a relatively new field as compared with, the other functional areas that we look at. So because of the different functional backgrounds of the founding fathers, so the discipline started out being very interdisciplinary, but over time, as you say, it became more siloed. And I think there is a downside to that. And I'm quoting Bruce Kogert here. So I can't remember at which year the conference was, but Bruce Kogert talked about looking at IB knowledge and also knowledge from the other functional disciplines as almost in the context of balance of trade. So he talked about IB being in a deficit position. Okay, we primarily borrow from theories and concepts in other disciplines. In return, there's very little export to other functional disciplines itself. And I think that that's something that we have lost, it seems, in the process of being more siloed, so that the publications in our top journals are now currently being read primarily by people in the international business community. I think that should be redressed because by nature, as I said, IB is multidisciplinary. So therefore, I hope that by proactively, engaging scholars in other functional disciplines, by showing, them that we not only borrow, but we can develop theories and concepts that would be relevant to them. So that could be, again, be a more even balance of trade between IB and the other functional areas. And that's something that I hope will happen.
There's a tall order, though. I mean, yes, you're right. Exports from the field is very, very, very low. Do you write every day? Do you work every day?
I work every day, and I know that my husband finds, so he always says, he says, when you were an assistant professor pre-tenure, you're working late in the evenings, working on weekends. And he said, now that you're a full professor, okay, you have a chair, you still work. And I said, well, because I enjoy what I do. And, so if I didn't, even if for whatever reason, I'm not, associated with a university, I think I would still be doing the kinds of things that I, like, which is writing, which is coming up with new knowledge. I find that when I engage in research, particularly on topics that I find very fascinating to me, I always learn something. And I've always told people, I said, like, even if my publication were not accepted for publication, I mean, obviously all of us want, in honesty, to have our research published. But I said, even if my research is not publishable, I'm still happy because I learned something about myself. Okay. And, so I think that's what keeps me going. So to me, research is, even though it's work, but to a certain extent it's play, because it really helps me know myself better. And I think that's what keeps me going all these years.
Interesting. About the idle curiosity question, in a state of idle curiosity, what does your mind think of? How do you come up with interesting, creative ideas, new topics to work on?
I try to find relations among systems or, concepts that hitherto appear to be very separate and distinct from each other. So let me give you an example. This past weekend, Virgil Abloh, who is the first African-American designer for Louis Vuitton, passed away, okay? And so I was reading his background, and I found that he was born in the United States of immigrant parents from Ghana. He got an engineering degree and a master's degree in architecture. So what has that got to, what is an engineering degree and what has architecture got to do with fashion designing? His mother was a seamstress, and so he learned the arts of the trade by learning from his mother. So I'm trying to draw the connection between things which are, like almost completely separate and distinct, and say, like, how has his background in architecture and civil engineering informed his passion and the outcome of his fashion design. And so in terms of a lot of my own research and in terms of my own thinking, it's trying to find the connections, so it's like connecting the dots. And to me, that's a light bulb moment when I find these kinds of connections.
Beautiful. About advice, so who had the most? No, it's actually not a fair question, but can you remember a couple of the top advice that you received when you were going through the program?
When I started on my PhD program?
Yeah.
Okay. I think my PhD supervisor always told me that I should show that I should demonstrate my competencies, and to a certain extent, it was particularly important for a woman and a woman who was an ethnic minority, because what people still have certain stereotypes about what women could or could not do back in the 70s. So I knew that I had to work extra hard, and to show that I could do as well, if not better. Okay. I know that, and I don't mean that in the arrogant sense, but it's almost like, I have to prove myself. And, but that also came very naturally because, as I said before, my parents have always impressed upon me the need for hard work, particularly my mother. So hard work, that was one thing. I think one of the things that my supervisor and my parents have always taught me is to be a good listener. I don't know it all. I guess all of us don't know it all. So we have to be, good listeners to listen to what people are saying. The world is not just about us. It's about other people and our interaction with other people, the image, and the impression that it leaves on other people. So I've learned to be a very good listener. And maybe that accounts for the fact that, I'm more quiet in social settings, because I don't want to be the person, that is dominating the conversation. I want to, listen. I want other people to feel comfortable, particularly, younger scholars, doctoral students, because I know how tongue-tied they might be, but I just want to show them that, I'm human. because just as the founding fathers of international business, as I said, have shown their human side to me, I want to, pass that along to others. And the advice which my mentor didn't give me, but my parents have always advised me, was that, treat others the same way that you want to be treated. And that has always, been with me. So each time when I interact with somebody, and before I say something, I would say, how would I feel or how would I react if somebody said that to me? And so I think in terms of the way that, for instance, if somebody asked me for advice on let's say on a research idea, I would always, couch it even if I think there needs to be a lot of work that has to be done in terms of developing that paper, developing that idea, I always try to frame it in a positive light and help people work toward that. So it's more of a developmental kind of function. And I feel that, or I find that people do remember these kinds of things. I'm oftentimes quite surprised when 10, 20 years later, people would write me and say, oh, when I first met you, or that you said this to me and you're nice, okay? And I think that makes a difference, okay? Because I could imagine myself, starting out, 40 years ago, if people that I met were nasty to me, were arrogant, I would say, oh, this is most probably not a profession that I want to engage in, or this is not a field that I most probably want to engage in. So I think it's, if I've received from other people the generosity and the kindness, I think it's my obligation really to pass it on to, to the future generations.
I mean, you've seen, at least over the past 50 years, many mistakes that junior faculty pre-tenure and doctoral students make. What are some of the things that you've observed that you say, these are the top 3 things that you should do or not do?
I think, well, one of the things is obviously to develop good listening skills, okay? And by listening skills, I mean also when we submit a paper to a journal, well, I would say for the top journals, the probability of its being rejected is very high. So for instance, if we look at JIPS, we see the rejection rate there is very high. If we look at the top academic management journals, the rejection rate is always very high. So first of all is to develop good listening skills to the feedback that is provided in the letter of rejection, okay? I would say in most instances, the reviewers and the action editor have good intentions in their heart. I think oftentimes we become so, so unhappy about the decision that we say, I'll just, delete this entire email. In the old days, I would, tear up something, okay? But I think that would be the wrong kind of approach. So we have to listen. The second advice that I would give is to deal with rejection. And again, that ties in with the high rejection rates of many of the top journals itself. I know it's very difficult to accept rejections. And I think all of us, okay, have had our manuscripts rejected. I could still remember the very first rejection letter that I got, okay? I could remember exactly where I was, okay? I mean, so this is the deep impression that it made me. And I cried buckets. And so I fully understand, how it hurts when there's a rejection, because we put so much of our heart and soul into writing that paper, all the work that goes into it. I've always said, it's like somebody saying that your baby is ugly, and, so that must be something that is very hurtful, but I think we have to get over that. So if I were to, and I've received many rejections in my life, okay, so I would say I would, put it aside for a couple of days, because obviously it's difficult to focus on it in the first couple of days. Put it aside, reread the comments, the feedback again, and then work harder on it. Okay. A third advice that I would give is, I find that some of the younger people now tend to be more calculating and strategizing, okay, to advance in the field. And I mean, obviously, all of us do need some kind of strategies, okay? We can't just, blindly blunder into something, okay? But I think if we were to over-strategize, and I've seen that, unfortunately, in terms of, like, who should we talk to, or who should I approach in a conference, or like, what should I do kind of thing. If we're to focus too much time on that, I think it really takes the fun out of the profession itself. And after all, in order to stay in the profession for a long period of time, we have to enjoy it and have some fun in the process itself. So I think that's very important.
About mid-career people, advice, well, it actually applies, dealing with the rejection, it applies to them as well. But is there anything specific for after tenure mid-career people that they should be doing?
I think after tenure, then it really depends upon what the person really likes. I mean, I know some people enjoy teaching over research, and that's perfectly fine. I mean, because after all, we do need, like, people that are very much dedicated to teaching. So I would say, one should channel their services or their attention more to, to the teaching component. I think service to the professions is also very important. Okay. I know that, for instance, in my own case, I could not be active in too many associations because I only have a limited number of time. So I've decided, that it's both with the Academy of Management and with AIB. And service. So service does take a whole lot of time. I still remember, like when I was on the executive board of the Academy of Management, and so particularly like the first few months, they were constantly talking about volunteers. I said, who are the volunteers? I naively asked, I said, who are these volunteers? They said, you're the volunteer because you're not paid for that service. And I said, and then it just dawned on me. I said, yeah, I'm a volunteer. I'm not paid for my service, but I'm spending a lot of my time, a lot of my energy, effort into this kind of activity itself. So it's really to engage in the service because you feel, at least I felt that it was my obligation to give back to a profession that has been very important to me. So I feel both AIB and the Academy of Management have been very important parts of my life. They have helped me develop the skills of being a good researcher, being a good teacher. So it was really my time to give back. And because these organizations have limited resources, that's why they need all these volunteers.
Rosalie, I want to follow up on a question that on a topic that you mentioned about how to deal with rejection or the publication process. Yes, you're right. Associate editors, editors-in-chief are usually very developmental. They push for the papers and they champion the paper to make the paper better. But how do you deal with bad reviewers who are not really, who are either too harsh, they are not really focused, not knowledgeable, not too competent. They just want to reject the paper because their experience was difficult when they were publishing. How do you deal with, as an author, as the contributor, how do you deal with bad reviewers?
I would say, unfortunately, there are some reviewers that are bad, quote unquote. And I've encountered some of those in my career, as I'm sure that most probably that you have, that you've encountered. So if it's, I would say, if we look at bad reviewers, okay, quote unquote, as those who only say negative things about your paper, okay, or about my paper. And really do not offer any kind of constructive advice as to, you know, how possibly one can turn this around. I mean, obviously, if the whole topic was, you know, does not merit research, and if the methodology was incorrect, okay, somehow that has to be conveyed to the author. But I think it has to be conveyed in a nice way. So it shouldn't be say, you know, that what you're doing is rubbish, okay, and you don't know anything. I think as a courtesy, as humans, I don't think we should be saying those kinds of nasty things to, you know, to anybody. I mean, ultimately, these kinds of things hurt, and we don't know how different people take it, okay? So I would say if it's those kind of bad, you know, bad reviewers, I would remove them as reviewers. Or if, let's say, if I'm just an author, I would say, yeah, you know, maybe the person had a bad day. I guess I'm an optimist in the sense that I always try to find an excuse as to why people do wrong. Okay, so I would say, you know, most probably the person had a bad day, you know, I mean, because I don't know who the reviewer is. Okay, but, you know, maybe that explains for it. But if it's a review that, you know, is very critical, okay, but there's truth to it, I would say that I would take that more seriously. So I wouldn't consider that to be a bad reviewer, okay? So let's say if the person was very critical about the kinds of, you know, let's say concepts that we put into there, I would say, well, is there any way that I can really redress this? Even if there's no way that I can satisfy this particular reviewer. Perhaps I could still, you know, like salvage, revise it in such a way that it could be published in another international business journal itself. I guess that's how I would approach it. But I do understand what you're saying, because I know very early on in my career, I had one reviewer that said that I invented multivariate analysis, okay? And, you know, so even though the person, and I have no idea who the person is, okay, you know, may not like what I did, okay, but I wish I could have invented multivariate analysis, you know, so I think one has to, you know, like really try to differentiate and distinguish between, you know, like what is critical, but still constructive, but, you know, what is, you know, just destructive to begin with.
Perfect. For the sake of time, unfortunately, what's the question that I should have asked you but haven't?
No, I think you've been very comprehensive in your questions, and perhaps I may want to tie in one last point, which is, and it goes back to this nurturing role that I talked about. So in terms of my enthusiasm for this whole issue of expatriate assignments, international assignments, I'm very gratified when I receive letters from my students 20 or 30 years later telling me that they undertook an international assignment. They became expatriates because of the enthusiasm that I showed in the field. And it really goes back to this, you know, saying that, you know, that we're in a sacred profession wherein we have this obligation, but at the same time, this extreme privilege of being able to influence young people as they, you know, start out on their lives and their careers itself. So I'm always very gratified by that particular aspect of it. I said, I feel like a mother, you know, so a lot of children out there in that sense.
Beautiful. Thank you. Rosalie, thank you so much for this interesting and candid interview. I learned a lot. I'm sure the audience will agree with me. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ilgas.